The village of Little Wickham possessed that particular quality of English countryside perfection that made passing motorists slow their vehicles and consider, however briefly, the possibility of a simpler life. On this warm afternoon in late June, the annual summer garden fete was in full flourish upon the grounds of Willowbrook Manor, where the ancient stone walls seemed to exhale centuries of quiet contentment into the honeysuckle-scented air. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the spreading branches of a venerable oak tree, her knitting needles working with the steady rhythm of someone for whom such tasks had long since become meditation. Her position afforded an excellent view of the festivities while maintaining the comfortable anonymity that served her so well in her observations of human nature. At 73, she had learned that people revealed their truest selves when they believed themselves unobserved, and a village fete provided abundant opportunities for such revelations. The manor itself, a Tudor gem with distinctive black timber framing and diamond-paned windows, presided over the scene with benevolent authority. Its current mistress, Mrs. Constance Hartwell, moved through her guests with the practiced grace of someone born to such occasions. At 62, she commanded respect through a combination of genuine warmth and an iron will that had guided Little Wickham's social calendar for the better part of 3 decades. Her particular pride was the manor's famous garden, especially the lower terrace where her collection of rare lilies bloomed behind an ornate wrought-iron gate that had become something of a village landmark. This gate, known locally as the Locked Gate, separated the public gardens from Mrs. Hartwell's private lily sanctuary. Its elaborate Victorian ironwork, painted a deep forest green and adorned with climbing roses, had remained locked for as long as anyone could remember, adding an air of mystery to the already enchanting grounds. The key, Mrs. Hartwell was fond of saying, resided safely in her personal keeping, for the lilies beyond were far too precious to risk to casual admirers. Among the afternoon's guests, several figures moved with the particular intensity that Miss Marple had learned to associate with people carrying significant burdens. Dr. Geoffrey Pemberton, the village physician, cut an imposing figure in his perfectly tailored suit, though Miss Marple noticed a certain rigidity in his bearing that suggested all was not entirely well in his ordered world. His wife Elena, still beautiful at 48 with her Mediterranean coloring, remained at his side with the dutiful attention of someone performing a well-rehearsed role. More intriguing still was Mr. Sebastian Blackwood, Mrs. Hartwell's nephew, who had recently returned to Little Wickham after a decade abroad in what he vaguely described as international business ventures. His expensive clothes and prematurely silver temples spoke of success, yet Miss Marple observed how his dark eyes constantly surveyed the gathering with the calculating gaze of someone perpetually assessing advantages and vulnerabilities. The Reverend Timothy Ashford provided a marked contrast with his youthful enthusiasm and modern ideas that had stirred considerable debate since his arrival at St. Mary's Parish. At 32, he brought an energy that some villagers found refreshing, while others considered dangerously progressive. He was accompanied by Miss Dorothy Fairfax, the village librarian, whose unmarried status at 35 had become a source of endless speculation among the more gossip-inclined residents. Near the refreshment tent, Mr. Lionel Fawcett held court with his usual air of someone privy to information others lacked. The proprietor of the village's antique shop, he possessed the particular talent of making even the most innocent conversation feel laden with hidden significance. His thin face and carefully groomed appearance suggested a man who understood the value of presentation, though Miss Marple had long suspected that his knowledge extended far beyond the provenance of old furniture and china. As the afternoon progressed with the gentle rhythm typical of such village occasions, Miss Marple found herself paying particular attention to the subtle dynamics playing out among the guests. She noticed how Dr. Pemberton's jaw tightened whenever Sebastian Blackwood approached his wife, how Miss Fairfax's eyes followed the young vicar with an intensity that spoke of feelings beyond mere professional admiration, and how Mr. Fawcett seemed to position himself within earshot of every significant conversation. It was during the height of the festivities, as the village brass band struck up a particularly enthusiastic rendition of Rule Britannia, that the first discordant note entered the afternoon's harmony. Young Timothy Ashford, the vicar's 10-year-old nephew visiting from London, came running across the lawn with a peculiar mixture of excitement and alarm that children display when they have discovered something both fascinating and frightening. "Aunt Dorothy! Aunt Dorothy!" he called to Miss Fairfax, his voice carrying clearly over the music. "There's something wrong with the locked gate. The lilies are all scattered about, and there's someone lying there." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, as if the afternoon itself were reluctant to acknowledge such an intrusion upon its perfection. Then, with the sudden efficiency that emerges in moments of crisis, several of the men moved toward the lower terrace, where the famous locked gate stood sentinel over Mrs. Hartwell's prized lily collection. Miss Marple rose from her chair with deliberate calm, her knitting carefully placed in her basket. She had witnessed enough of life's darker moments to know that the next few minutes would likely reveal truths that had been carefully hidden beneath the village's placid surface. As she followed the small group making its way through the gardens, she noticed details that others, in their haste and alarm, might overlook. The way Sebastian Blackwood's hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette. How Dr. Pemberton automatically checked his pocket watch as if calculating time, and the peculiar stillness that had come over Mr. Fawcett's usually animated features. The locked gate, when they reached it, told a story that would haunt Little Wickham for months to come. The ornate ironwork stood open, its ancient lock mechanism clearly forced, and scattered across the flagstone path lay the crushed remains of dozens of white lilies. But it was not the damaged flowers that drew sharp intakes of breath from the assembled group. It was the still form of Mrs. Constance Hartwell herself, lying among the scattered petals with her arms arranged as if she had been carefully positioned, and clutched in her right hand a single perfect lily whose pristine white petals seemed to mock the violence that had clearly taken place. Dr. Pemberton knelt beside the body with professional efficiency, though Miss Marple noticed how his hands shook as he checked for signs of life that everyone present knew he would not find. "She's been dead for at least an hour," he announced quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "We must call the police immediately." As the group stood in shocked silence around the violated sanctuary, Miss Marple's keen eyes took inventory of details that would prove crucial in the days to come. The way the gate's lock showed signs of having been picked rather than forced, the curious absence of soil on Mrs. Hartwell's hands despite her apparent fall among the flower beds, and most telling of all, the fact that the single lily in her grasp showed no signs of the crushing that had befallen its scattered companions. "How very strange," Miss Marple murmured softly, her words barely audible above the distant strains of the brass band, still playing its cheerful melodies for guests who had not yet learned that their peaceful afternoon had been shattered as thoroughly as the lilies scattered at their feet. The summer garden, fate at Willowbrook Manor, would be remembered not for its prizes and pleasantries, but as the day when murder came to Little Wickham, arriving as silently and unexpectedly as the evening shadows that were already beginning to lengthen across the once perfect lawns. The news of Mrs. Hartwell's death rippled through the remaining guests with the peculiar efficiency that characterizes village gatherings when confronted with the extraordinary. Within moments, the cheerful brass band had fallen silent, their instruments lowered as whispered conversations replaced the afternoon's festive chatter. Children were quickly gathered by their mothers, while men formed small clusters near the refreshment tent, their voices low but urgent as they attempted to make sense of what had occurred beyond the locked gate. Miss Marple repositioned herself near the tea table, where experience had taught her that people in distress often sought the comfort of familiar rituals. From this vantage point, she could observe the various reactions without appearing to do so, her knitting needles working steadily as her keen eyes catalogued the subtle behaviors that others caught up in their shock and speculation, might easily overlook. Dr. Pemberton had assumed natural authority, directing someone to telephone the police while ensuring that curious onlookers remained well clear of the lily garden. Yet Miss Marple noticed how his professional composure seemed forced, and she observed the way his wife Elena stood unusually still, her dark eyes fixed on some middle distance as if seeing something others could not perceive. When Mrs. Bantry offered Elena a cup of tea, her hands trembled so violently that she nearly dropped the delicate china, a reaction that seemed excessive even given the shocking circumstances. The theories began almost immediately, each more elaborate than the last. Mr. Lionel Fawcett, never one to miss an opportunity for drama, held court near the bunting-decorated entrance, his thin voice carrying clearly across the subdued gathering. "I always suspected there were secrets connected to that locked gate," he declared to his captivated audience, which included the still-shaken Miss Fairfax and several other villagers. Mrs. Hartwell was a woman of considerable means and, shall we say, strong opinions. Perhaps someone from her past finally decided to settle an old score. His words carried the particular authority that comes from years of observing village life through the lens of an antique dealer, yet Miss Marple detected an underlying nervousness beneath his usual self-importance. She noted how he kept glancing toward Sebastian Blackwood, who stood apart from the main group, smoking cigarette after cigarette with mechanical precision. Sebastian himself presented an interesting study in controlled grief. His responses to the few questions directed his way were brief and appropriately somber. Yet Miss Marple observed how his eyes constantly surveyed the gathering, as if calculating something beyond mere social obligations. When young Timothy Ashford approached with stammered condolences, Sebastian's acknowledgement was oddly formal, almost as if he were speaking to a stranger rather than someone he had known since childhood. The arrival of Inspector Morrison from the county constabulary brought temporary focus to the chaos, though his presence seemed to heighten rather than diminish the tension among certain guests. Morrison, a competent man in his 50s with the methodical approach typical of rural police work, began taking preliminary statements, and it was during these initial interviews that the first significant contradictions emerged. Dr. Pemberton stated with medical certainty that Mrs. Hartwell had been dead for at least an hour, when discovered, placing the time of death around 3 o'clock. However, several guests claimed to have seen her moving about the grounds as late as 3:30. The afternoon postman insisted he had delivered a registered letter to her personally at 20 minutes to 4. When confronted with these discrepancies, each witness became defensive, insisting on their own accuracy while suggesting others might be mistaken. The Reverend Timothy Ashford provided what appeared to be the most straightforward account, describing his movements around the fete with pastoral precision. Yet his timeline contained a curious 20-minute gap that he attributed to a private conversation with a parishioner who had since departed. When pressed for details, the young vicar became visibly uncomfortable, citing pastoral confidentiality in a way that seemed almost rehearsed. Miss Fairfax, when questioned, mentioned seeing Elena Pemberton walking alone near the rose garden around 3:30, appearing distressed and speaking quietly to herself in what sounded like Italian. Elena's reaction to this observation was swift and sharp, insisting that Miss Fairfax must be confused as she never spoke Italian in public, a response that struck Miss Marple as oddly specific and offensive. Mr. Fawcett's statement proved the most elaborate, complete with minute-by-minute details of his afternoon activities and references to specific conversations. Yet his account seemed almost too perfect, lacking the natural inconsistencies that characterize genuine recollection. Moreover, his timeline placed him in positions that would have given him oversight of everyone else's movements, a coincidence that seemed rather convenient. As the formal interviews concluded and guests began to disperse, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious nature of the crime itself. The forced lock suggested premeditation, yet the scattered lilies implied either great haste or deliberate staging. Most intriguing was the single perfect flower clutched in Mrs. Hartwell's hand, its pristine condition contrasting sharply with the crushed petals scattered across the flagstones. The evening shadows were lengthening across the manor grounds as Miss Marple prepared to depart, but not before taking one final look at the cordoned area. Something about the scene continued to trouble her, some detail that seemed wrong in a way she could not yet articulate. As she walked slowly toward the village, her mind was already working on the puzzle presented, sorting through statements and observations, searching for the patterns that would eventually reveal the truth behind the tragedy at Willowbrook Manor. Morning brought Inspector Morrison back to Little Wickham with a small team of investigators and the methodical efficiency that characterized serious police work. Miss Marple, who had spent a restless night contemplating the various inconsistencies from the previous afternoon, decided that a morning constitutional would be entirely appropriate for someone of her habits. She positioned herself on the bench outside St. Mary's Church, her knitting bag beside her, where she could observe the renewed activity at Willowbrook Manor, while appearing to do nothing more than enjoy the sunshine. The inspector's team moved with professional precision, photographing the lily garden and collecting samples, yet their body language suggested they were finding precious little conclusive evidence. The outdoor crime scene, contaminated by hundreds of fake visitors, presented obvious challenges. Morrison would need to rely heavily on witness statements and the subtler clues that spoke of human motive and opportunity. Exactly the sort of investigation where Miss Marple's particular talents proved most valuable. Her first revelation came through a chance encounter at the post office, where she learned that the registered letter delivery had been more ambiguous than initially reported. Alf Briggs, the postman, admitted under gentle questioning that he had not actually watched Mrs. Hartwell sign the receipt. The housekeeper had fetched a pen while he attended to other business, and upon returning, he found the slip neatly signed. This detail cast doubt on the timeline that placed Mrs. Hartwell alive at 20 minutes to 4, suggesting someone else might have forged her signature. More intriguing still was Inspector Morrison's discovery about the famous locked gate. The Victorian lock showed signs of theatrical damage rather than genuine forcing, scarring designed to suggest violence while the mechanism had actually been opened with a skeleton key. This revelation pointed to premeditation and considerable skill, eliminating the possibility of a crime of passion or opportunity. Miss Marple's examination of the physical evidence proved equally illuminating. Tom Weaver, the gardener, confirmed that several lily stems had been cut cleanly rather than crushed, the precise diagonal slices typical of a florist's work. More significantly, Mrs. Hartwell's clothing showed not a speck of pollen despite the scattered flowers surrounding her body, and no gardening gloves had been recovered. For a woman particular about her prized lilies, such cleanliness seemed impossible under genuine circumstances. The formal interviews conducted in the manor's drawing room revealed a web of alibis that were plausible yet incomplete. Dr. Pemberton maintained his medical assessment of the time of death, now refined to closer to 3 o'clock, though he showed visible irritation when confronted with conflicting witness statements. His wife Elena, questioned separately, maintained her composure but seemed brittle, her gaze frequently drifting toward the windows as if seeking escape from the inspector's probing questions. Sebastian Blackwood presented sophisticated nonchalance, claiming to have spent the crucial hour browsing the manor's library. While admitting to recent business setbacks, he insisted his aunt's will held no significant financial motivation for him. Yet Miss Marple remembered the calculating look in his eyes and wondered about his definition of modest expectations. The Reverend Timothy Ashford remained troubled by his 20-minute gap, this time admitting to a deeply personal conversation with a parishioner regarding a crisis of faith. His honor-bound silence about the details left Morrison frustrated, though the young vicar's distress appeared genuine rather than calculated. Miss Fairfax provided perhaps the most significant new information, revealing that Eleanor Pemberton had not been alone near the rose garden as previously thought. Someone had been watching from behind the hedge, though the librarian had caught only a glimpse of movement before the observer disappeared. This detail, omitted from her original statement out of concern for Eleanor, suggested surveillance or stalking behavior that cast the Italian conversation in a more sinister light. Mr. Fawcett's account remained suspiciously comprehensive, his timeline placing him in positions that would have allowed observation of everyone else's movements. His detailed narrative seemed almost too perfect, lacking the natural inconsistencies of genuine recollection. More troubling was his uncharacteristic reticence about speculating on the murderer's identity, a marked departure from his usual eagerness to share dramatic theories. The day's most intriguing revelation came from young Timothy Ashford, who approached Miss Marple with hesitant confusion. He distinctly remembered trying the gate handle earlier when his ball went over the fence, finding it securely locked. If his recollection was accurate, someone had unlocked the gate between his earlier passage and his discovery of the body. Someone with either a key or considerable skill with locks. Mrs. Bly, the housekeeper, provided another crucial detail about the missing key. It had disappeared the previous week, causing considerable household tension, only to reappear mysteriously on the breakfast tray the morning before the fete. This convenient timing suggested careful planning rather than coincidence. As Miss Marple walked slowly home, her mind worked through the emerging pattern, the theatrical lock damage, the absent pollen, the cleanly cut stems, the forged signature, and the mysteriously returning key all pointed to elaborate staging rather than spontaneous violence. Someone had taken considerable care to create a specific impression while concealing their true method and motive. The single perfect lily clutched in Mrs. Hartwell's hand continued to puzzle her most of all. In a scene of apparent violence and scattered destruction, why had this one flower remained pristine? Miss Marple suspected that when she understood the significance of that untouched bloom, she would understand everything else about this carefully orchestrated deception that had shattered Little Wickham's peaceful facade. Inspector Morrison's investigation had crystallized around Sebastian Blackwood with the methodical certainty of a man who valued resolution over complexity. By the fourth day following Mrs. Hartwell's murder, the evidence against her nephew had accumulated into what appeared to be an unassailable case, satisfying both the inspector's professional instincts and the considerable pressure from his superiors for a swift conclusion to such a high-profile crime. The financial motive proved more compelling upon detailed examination than Sebastian's initial dismissive comments had suggested. His business ventures in Eastern Europe had collapsed catastrophically, leaving him with debts that exceeded his visible assets by nearly £200,000. Creditors had grown increasingly aggressive, with several making threats that extended well beyond conventional legal remedies. Mrs. Hartwell's recently updated will named Sebastian as primary beneficiary, inheriting not only Willowbrook Manor but also a substantial investment portfolio that would easily resolve his financial difficulties. More damaging still was the discovery of Sebastian's expertise with security systems, skills acquired during his years abroad in what he euphemistically described as consulting work. When pressed for specifics, he became evasive, citing client confidentiality, while admitting to knowledge that would certainly encompass Victorian lock mechanisms. His fingerprints had been found on several recently disturbed books in the Manor's library, though the timing remained impossible to establish with precision. The pressure on Morrison intensified from multiple directions. The county chief constable demanded regular updates, while the local newspaper ran sensational headlines about the Blackwood heir's dark secret, fueling public opinion against Sebastian. The narrative satisfied everyone's expectations about family greed and hidden resentments, providing the kind of straightforward solution that restored confidence in both justice and social order. Yet it was precisely this neat resolution that troubled Miss Marple most deeply. Her extensive experience with human nature's darker impulses had taught her to be suspicious of cases that resolved too conveniently. Real murderers, she had observed, rarely left such obvious trails of evidence, particularly those who possessed Sebastian's demonstrated intelligence and sophistication. Her doubts were reinforced by a revealing conversation with Mrs. Bligh, who disclosed crucial information about the household's recent financial arrangements. Mrs. Hartwell had indeed been concerned about Sebastian's difficulties, but her response had been characteristically practical, rather than punitive. She had arranged to transfer a substantial sum to cover his immediate debts, with the paperwork scheduled for completion the week following the fete. This revelation completely undermined Sebastian's supposed motive, as he stood to benefit more from his aunt's continued survival and generosity than from her death. The timing of the murder, occurring just days before this financial rescue would have materialized, seemed particularly poor planning for someone of Sebastian's obvious intelligence. Miss Marple found herself remembering a case from St. Mary Mead where the obvious suspect had been innocent, precisely because the evidence against him had been too perfect, too accommodating to investigative assumptions. The reactions of other villagers to Sebastian's emerging status as prime suspect revealed telling patterns that further supported Miss Marple's skepticism. Dr. Pemberton displayed obvious relief at the investigation's direction, his previous tension replaced by professional satisfaction. His wife Eleanor, however, seemed increasingly agitated as Sebastian's guilt became accepted fact, her distress appearing to exceed mere sympathy for an acquaintance's predicament. Mr. Fawcett's behavior proved most intriguing of all. His usual eagerness to speculate about village scandals had been replaced by uncharacteristic discretion, particularly regarding Sebastian's situation. When directly questioned about his opinion of the case, Fawcett deflected with vague philosophical observations about human nature's complexity, a marked departure from his typical dramatic pronouncements. The physical evidence continued to present contradictions that the police seemed eager to overlook. The cleanly cut lily stems suggested botanical knowledge and proper tools, yet Sebastian had never shown particular interest in gardening. The theatrical damage to the lock implied someone wanting to create a specific impression of forced entry, but such elaborate staging seemed unnecessary if the goal was simply financial gain through inheritance. Most puzzling remained the single perfect lily in Mrs. Hartwell's hand. Inspector Morrison had dismissed this detail as coincidental, perhaps a flower she had been examining when attacked. But Miss Marple's gardening experience told her that lilies were not typically handled in such a manner, and the complete absence of pollen on Mrs. Hartwell's fingers suggested the flower had been placed there after death, rather than grasped during life. Additional evidence emerged that further complicated the neat case against Sebastian. Alf Briggs, the postman, admitted under gentle questioning that he had not actually witnessed Mrs. Hartwell sign the registered receipt. The housekeeper had fetched a pen while he attended to other business, returning to find the slip neatly signed. This detail suggested someone else might have forged her signature, casting doubt on the timeline that supposedly established her presence at the crucial moment. Miss Marple also discovered that several items had been strategically positioned in the drawing room during Morrison's interviews. A pencil with unusually dark lead, a small pad of receipt blanks, and other materials that would facilitate document forgery. The careful placement suggested someone wanted these items to be noticed, though not too obviously. As evening approached and Morrison prepared to make his arrest, Miss Marple found herself walking past Willowbrook Manor once again. The lily garden remained cordoned with police tape, but new blooms had opened since the tragedy, their white petals gleaming in the fading light. She sensed that the most important secrets remained hidden, concealed not behind ornate metalwork, but within the complex relationships and motivations of people who had lived their entire lives in Little Wycombe's deceptively peaceful embrace. Despite Inspector Morrison's growing confidence in Sebastian Blackwood's guilt, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the manufactured quality of the evidence. Her decades of observing human nature had taught her that genuine crimes, even carefully planned ones, rarely presented such conveniently obvious solutions. The case against Sebastian felt too neat, too accommodating to investigative assumptions, like a stage set designed to direct attention away from the real drama unfolding elsewhere. The persistent detail that continued to occupy her thoughts was the single, pristine lily clutched in Mrs. Hartwell's hand. Every aspect of the crime scene suggested violence and haste, yet this one flower remained perfect, unmarked by the crushing that had befallen its scattered companions. More significantly, Mrs. Hartwell's fingers showed no trace of pollen, despite handling what should have been a freshly picked bloom. Miss Marple's own gardening experience told her that lilies, particularly the delicate varieties Mrs. Hartwell cultivated, were impossible to handle without leaving golden traces on skin and clothing. Her seemingly casual morning walk took her past Fawcett's Antiques, where she paused to admire a display of Victorian keys in the window. Mr. Fawcett emerged with his usual theatrical concern, though she noticed how his hands bore faint stains that suggested recent work with carbon paper, rather than the furniture polish one might expect. When she mentioned the interesting lock mechanism at Willowbrook Manor, his response came too quickly, too knowledgeably, as if he had been expecting such a question. At St. Mary's, she found young Reverend Ashford polishing brass with unusual intensity, his obvious distress seeming to exceed mere grief for a parishioner. A book lay open on the vestry table, a library volume about Victorian lock mechanisms, hastily covered when Miss Fairfax appeared to collect it. The librarian's explanation about a historical lecture felt rehearsed, and Miss Marple noted how Dorothy's protective instincts toward the young vicar had perhaps led her into uncharacteristic deceptions. The most revealing discovery came from young Timothy Ashford, whose childlike attention to detail had captured something the adults had missed. He approached Miss Marple with genuine puzzlement about the scattered lilies, remembering that earlier in the day he had seen not only white blooms in the garden but yellow and pink varieties as well. This observation struck her with sudden clarity. Someone had selectively chosen which flowers to scatter and which to remove, creating a specific visual impression while concealing another purpose entirely. Her subsequent examination of the lily garden, granted by Morrison's patronizing indulgence, confirmed her suspicions. The beds showed evidence of careful, systematic harvesting rather than random destruction. Specific varieties had been completely removed, their absence disguised by the theatrical scattering of common white lilies. The crime had not been about inheritance or family resentment. It had been about theft, with murder committed to silence a witness who had discovered the systematic pillaging of her prized collection. This revelation transformed her understanding of the various alibis and behaviors she had observed. Dr. Pemberton's medical practice would provide access to the specialized knowledge needed for plant preservation and transport. His wife Elena's distress seemed less about shock and more about fear of discovery, particularly when viewed alongside Miss Fairfax's observation of her speaking Italian near the rose garden, possibly coordinating with contacts in the international plant trade. Mr. Fawcett's comprehensive knowledge of everyone's movements during the fete suggested not casual observation, but systematic surveillance, coordinating timing with an operation already in progress. His antique business would provide perfect cover for contacts in specialized markets where rare botanical specimens commanded substantial prices. Even the mysterious 20-minute gap in Reverend Ashford's timeline took on new significance. His claimed conversation about a crisis of faith might have been cover for discovering the theft in progress or confronting Mrs. Hartwell about her suspicions. The young vicar's obvious moral distress could stem from knowledge he felt unable to reveal without breaking confidences or implicating others. The forged signature on the registered receipt now made perfect sense as well. Someone needed to establish that Mrs. Hartwell was alive later than she actually was, providing cover for the completion of the theft operation. The skill required suggested someone with practice in document handling, perhaps a librarian accustomed to various handwriting styles, or an antique dealer familiar with authentication techniques. Most telling of all was the careful placement of that pristine lily in Mrs. Hartwell's hand. It had been positioned there deliberately, not as evidence of struggle, but as a signature of sorts, a twisted tribute from someone who understood botanical symbolism. In the language of flowers, white lilies represented rebirth and renewal, perhaps the killer's justification for transforming living specimens into profit through Mrs. Hartwell's death. As evening approached and Morrison prepared to finalize Sebastian's arrest, Miss Marple realized that time was running short. The real murderer remained free while an innocent man faced charges, and the stolen plants were likely already being moved through networks that would make recovery impossible. She needed to act decisively to expose the truth before justice became permanently misdirected. And she believed she now understood exactly how to set the trap that would reveal the killer's true identity. The perfect lily had been intended as the murderer's final touch of artistry, but it would instead become the thread that unraveled their carefully woven deception. Miss Marple awoke the next morning with the peculiar clarity that comes when scattered observations finally arrange themselves into a coherent pattern. The case against Sebastian Blackwood might satisfy Inspector Morrison's need for resolution, but it failed to address the fundamental inconsistencies that had troubled her from the beginning. The pristine lily, the absent pollen, the theatrical lock damage. These details spoke of careful orchestration rather than desperate violence, and she was now convinced she understood both the true motive and the identity of Mrs. Hartwell's killer. Her first strategic visit was to Fawcett's Antiques, where she found Lionel arranging a display of Victorian keys with unusual concentration. The shop's familiar atmosphere of old wood and polish now carried an underlying tension that became more pronounced when she mentioned Mrs. Hartwell's remarkable lily collection. His response came too quickly, too knowledgeably, as he described the delicate process of transporting rare botanical specimens. More telling still were the faint graphite smears on his cuffs and the distinct scent of camphor near a crate stenciled for international shipping. When Miss Marple admired his expertise with antique locks, his nervous laughter confirmed her suspicions that his knowledge extended well beyond legitimate business interests. At the Pemberton residence, Elena received her with Mediterranean courtesy, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee from a silver service. Miss Marple's seemingly innocent observation about lily pollen's tendency to stain upholstery produced a revealing response. Elena immediately mentioned removing anthers to prevent such problems, demonstrating botanical knowledge that seemed excessive for casual gardening. More significantly, when the conversation touched on plant preservation techniques, Elena's discomfort became palpable, her explanations about family connections in Italy trailing off into uncomfortable silence. Dr. Pemberton's arrival provided additional confirmation, his spotless appearance contrasting sharply with his obvious nervousness when Miss Marple inquired about pollen as evidence of handling time. The crucial breakthrough came from Tom Weaver, the gardener, whose professional pride had been offended by suggestions that Mrs. Hartwell's lilies had been carelessly trampled. His examination of the crime scene had revealed systematic cutting rather than random destruction, with anthers carefully removed from selected specimens. Most significantly, a pair of pruning shears had disappeared from the potting shed, and Tom recalled seeing a shaded lantern light behind the hedge on Thursday evening. Someone with intimate knowledge of the garden's layout conducting secretive work under cover of darkness. Miss Fairfax's nervous behavior at the library provided another piece of the puzzle. A botanical press lay half-concealed beneath circulation records, and her explanation about a school nature club felt rehearsed and unconvincing. More damaging was her admission about the forged postal receipt, revealing that she had signed Mrs. Hartwell's name to avoid fuss when the postman became impatient. This deception, however well-intentioned, had provided crucial cover for establishing a false timeline of Mrs. Hartwell's final hours. The Reverend Ashford's confession about his missing 20 minutes proved equally illuminating, though in ways he perhaps did not fully comprehend. His pastoral conversation with Elena Pemberton had concerned her desperation over debts to family members abroad. debts that could be resolved through access to valuable botanical specimens. His observation of someone near the potting shed, carrying what appeared to be a walking stick and emanating the scent of mothballs, aligned perfectly with the camphor odor Miss Marple had detected at Fawcett's shop. The systematic nature of the theft became clear as Miss Marple pieced together months of careful planning. Mrs. Hartwell's prized lily collection, valued by experts at nearly £50,000, had been gradually depleted through sophisticated removals that initially appeared to be natural losses. Elena Pemberton's family connections in the Italian horticultural trade provided both the expertise and the international contacts necessary for disposing of stolen specimens, while her husband's medical knowledge enabled the precise timing and execution of the murder when Mrs. Hartwell finally discovered their operation. The locked gate had served not as protection, but as camouflage, its key mysteriously disappearing and reappearing to facilitate the final phase of the theft. The theatrical damage to the lock mechanism was designed to suggest external intrusion while concealing the fact that the real crimes had been inside operations requiring intimate knowledge of both the property and Mrs. Hartwell's routines. Most revealing of all was the single perfect lily placed in Mrs. Hartwell's hand. Not a tribute from a grieving murderer, but a calculated signature from someone who understood botanical symbolism. The killer had positioned it there deliberately, perhaps as twisted justification for transforming living beauty into profit through violence. As evening approached and Inspector Morrison prepared to finalize Sebastian's arrest, Miss Marple realized that exposing the truth would require more than circumstantial evidence and logical deduction. She needed to create circumstances that would force the real killers to reveal themselves through actions that demonstrated their guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The carefully maintained facade of respectability that had enabled their crimes would become the very mechanism through which justice would ultimately be served. She reached for her telephone, her mind already formulating the subtle trap that would bring this elaborate deception to its inevitable conclusion. The pristine lily had been intended as the murderer's final artistic touch, but it would instead become the thread that unraveled their carefully woven web of lies and theft. The breakthrough Miss Marple had been anticipating arrived through young Timothy Ashford's persistent curiosity about details that adults had dismissed as unimportant. The boy approached her outside the village post office with the excitement of someone who had made a significant discovery, though he seemed uncertain about its importance. His careful exploration of the lily garden's perimeter had revealed a second key, older and more worn than the ornate Victorian original, hidden beneath loose stones near the garden's back entrance where the service road provided discreet access to the manor grounds. This discovery transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the entire operation. The existence of a second key suggested that someone had maintained secret access to Mrs. Hartwell's prized collection for considerably longer than anyone had suspected. The theft had not been a recent desperate measure prompted by Sebastian's financial difficulties, but rather a systematic operation that had been depleting the garden's treasures for months, perhaps years. Timothy's description of strange activities during previous visits, late evening lights moving through the garden, the sound of vehicles during inappropriate hours, and the recurring presence of his mothball man, painted a picture of organized criminal activity rather than spontaneous violence. Miss Marple's subsequent conversations with key village figures revealed the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy she was unraveling. Mrs. Bantry, always eager to share local knowledge, recalled Mrs. Hartwell's increasing agitation in recent weeks about missing specimens, particularly rare varieties that she believed had been pinched by someone with intimate knowledge of her collection. The late Mrs. Hartwell had apparently suspected theft, but had been conducting her own discreet investigation rather than involving the authorities, a decision that had ultimately cost her life. Her strategic visit to Reverend Ashford provided additional confirmation of the psychological pressure building among the conspirators. The young vicar expressed particular concern for Miss Fairfax, whose pale complexion and nervous demeanor had become increasingly noticeable since the murder. His mention of Dorothy's distress over rumors about the value of Mrs. Hartwell's lilies, particularly after overhearing Mr. Fawcett discussing them with unusual intensity at the village market, suggested that the librarian's involvement might be more complex than simple document forgery. The psychological trap Miss Marple had been carefully constructing reached its crucial phase when she arranged what appeared to be a casual social gathering at her cottage, ostensibly to discuss memorial arrangements honoring Mrs. Hartwell. The guest list included all the principal figures from the investigation, creating an atmosphere of forced normalcy that would prove impossible for the guilty parties to maintain under sustained observation. During the carefully orchestrated evening, Miss Marple introduced seemingly innocent topics that gradually increased pressure on those with secrets to hide. Her discussion of botanical preservation techniques prompted Elena Pemberton to demonstrate knowledge that far exceeded casual gardening interest, while observations about international plant smuggling caused visible distress among several guests. Most significantly, her production of the second key that Timothy had discovered, presented as evidence that Mrs. Hartwell had suspected theft and been conducting her own investigation, prompted immediate and telling reactions from the conspirators. The evening's crucial moment came when Miss Marple revealed that Mrs. Hartwell had been maintaining detailed photographic records of her collection, documenting every specimen in ways that would make significant theft immediately apparent to botanical experts. These records, she announced with deliberate casualness, had been discovered in the manor's safe and were now being examined by specialists who could easily identify missing varieties and trace their movements through international markets. The psychological pressure intensified further when she mentioned that several rare lily varieties had been traced to recent European sales with documentation that would eventually lead back to their sources. The international scope of such investigations, she observed, would make it impossible for anyone involved to simply disappear or claim ignorance of the operation's extent. As the evening progressed, the careful facade maintained by the conspirators began showing dangerous cracks. Elena's desperate glances toward her husband, Dr. Pemberton's obvious calculation of diminishing options, and Mr. Fawcett's increasingly nervous energy all suggested people who recognized their elaborate deception was finally collapsing under the weight of accumulated evidence and relentless psychological pressure. The twist that would ultimately expose the conspiracy came the following morning when fire bells awakened the village to dramatic scenes at Fawcett's Antiques. The shop's windows gaped like scorched mouths, releasing the acrid scent of smoke mingled with the sharp medicinal odor of camphor that Miss Marple immediately recognized as a preservative used in botanical shipping. Mr. Fawcett, pale and singed, sat on a stool recounting his tale of masked intruders to anyone who would listen, but his story contained the theatrical elements that Miss Marple had learned to associate with calculated deception rather than genuine trauma. Her examination of the fire scene revealed crucial evidence. Soot on Fawcett's cuff that ran in clean, finger-length streaks, suggesting post-fire manipulation. Shipping invoices arranged too deliberately among the debris, and most significantly, a warped crate stenciled for international delivery, containing the blackened remains of botanical specimens. The fire, she realized, had been a desperate attempt to destroy evidence while creating a diversion for the final phase of the smuggling operation. The morning's events confirmed her suspicions that the real criminals, emboldened by Sebastian's arrest, had grown overconfident and careless. Their attempt to eliminate evidence had instead provided the concrete proof needed to expose their systematic theft of Mrs. Hartwell's precious lilies and the murder committed to silence her G. The morning after the suspicious fire at Fawcett's Antiques brought Inspector Morrison face to face with a crime scene that seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate the truth. The acrid smoke still hung in the air as he surveyed the charred remains, listening to Lionel Fawcett's increasingly theatrical account of masked intruders and deliberate destruction. Miss Marple, positioned at a respectful distance with her knitting, observed details that the inspector's official focus overlooked. The selective nature of the fire's damage, the lingering scent of camphor that spoke of botanical preservatives, and, most tellingly, Fawcett's nervous energy that suggested relief rather than genuine trauma. The fire had consumed the international shipping crate she had noted previously, along with what appeared to be carefully arranged documentation, yet the back room remained largely intact, despite smoke damage. This selective destruction spoke of desperate haste rather than random arson, confirming her suspicions that the conspirators felt their elaborate deception approaching collapse. The timing, occurring just as Sebastian's arrest seemed imminent, suggested a final attempt to eliminate physical evidence while creating a convenient alternative narrative for any remaining inconsistencies. Miss Marple's careful observation of the other key figures revealed the psychological pressure building within their carefully maintained facades. Dr. Pemberton arrived with professional concern, but displayed unmistakable relief as he assessed the damage, engaging in urgent whispered conversations with Elena, whose Mediterranean composure had given way to barely controlled panic. Her repeated glances toward the approaching police vehicles and nervous clutching of her handbag suggested someone calculating escape routes rather than processing shocking news about a neighbor's misfortune. Miss Fairfax's behavior proved equally revealing, her usual quiet efficiency replaced by trembling agitation as she moved restlessly between the library and church. Reverend Ashford's growing concern for the librarian, combined with his hints about her deeper anxieties regarding the forged postal receipt, suggested that Dorothy's involvement might extend beyond simple document manipulation into more serious complicity with the botanical theft operation. Recognizing that the fire represented both opportunity and crisis, Miss Marple implemented the psychological trap she had been carefully constructing. Her strategic announcement that she intended to organize a memorial garden using Mrs. Hartwell's surviving specimens would require expert botanical examination of the lily collection by specialists who could immediately identify missing varieties and trace their movements through international markets. This seemingly benevolent project created the perfect pretext for bringing external expertise to bear on evidence that the fire had failed to eliminate completely. The crucial element of her plan involved revealing that Mrs. Hartwell had maintained comprehensive photographic documentation of her collection, with detailed records that would make systematic theft immediately apparent to qualified experts. These photographs, she announced with calculated casualness, had been discovered in the manor's fireproof safe and were now being examined by botanical specialists who could trace specific varieties through international smuggling networks. The prospect of such scrutiny prompted immediate and telling reactions from those with secrets to hide. Elena Pemberton's offer to assist with translation of any Italian correspondence, presented as helpful cooperation, revealed knowledge that extended far beyond casual cultural familiarity. Her accurate interpretation of technical botanical terms and shipping procedures demonstrated expertise that would be impossible to explain as coincidental, while her nervous energy and repeated suggestions that such documentation might prove unreliable betrayed someone facing imminent exposure rather than innocent grief. Dr. Pemberton's medical composure began showing dangerous cracks when Miss Marple described photographs showing lilies with carefully removed anthers, a preservation technique meaningful only to someone familiar with plant smuggling operations. His immediate calculation of timing and distances, combined with his obvious assessment of diminishing options, suggested someone whose professional knowledge had been systematically applied to criminal purposes. The psychological breaking point came when Miss Marple revealed young Timothy's discovery of additional evidence, a makeshift botanical press hidden in the old stable, along with shipping materials and correspondence that suggested coordination with overseas contacts. This announcement, delivered with her characteristic gentle certainty, created the perfect test of each suspect's psychological resilience under mounting pressure. Fawcett's reaction proved most illuminating of all, His usual theatrical confidence cracked completely as he realized the implications of evidence that his carefully staged fire had failed to eliminate. His desperate attempts to redirect suspicion toward Sebastian became increasingly frantic, revealing someone whose role as victim was merely another layer of deception designed to conceal his function as the operations coordinator and international contact point. The trap's effectiveness became apparent as the carefully maintained relationships among the conspirators began showing strain under psychological pressure. Elena's desperate glances toward her husband, Dr. Pemberton's obvious calculation of medical alibis and timing, and Fawcett's nervous rearrangement of his remaining inventory all suggested people who recognized their elaborate deception was finally approaching its inevitable collapse. Miss Marple's final strategic move involved arranging what appeared to be a casual examination of Mrs. Hartwell's photographic records in the Manor's morning room, creating circumstances where the guilty parties would feel compelled to observe while maintaining their facades of innocent cooperation. The psychological pressure of watching botanical experts examine evidence of their systematic theft, combined with the knowledge that their fire had failed to eliminate crucial documentation, would create the perfect conditions for the revealing mistake that would expose their guilt beyond reasonable doubt. As evening approached and the various suspects prepared for what they increasingly recognized as a final test of their deception, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate web of greed, expertise, and desperation that had transformed Mrs. Hartwell's beloved lily garden into the scene of both systematic theft and calculated murder, rowing suspicions about their elaborate criminal enterprise. The morning room at Willowbrook Manor had been transformed into an impromptu courtroom where truth would finally emerge through the careful orchestration of evidence and human psychology. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating Mrs. Hartwell's leather-bound photographic album spread across her ornate writing desk, each page documenting years of devoted cultivation with meticulous precision. Miss Marple sat quietly beside these records, her knitting needles working with steady rhythm as Inspector Morrison positioned himself near the fireplace, his skeptical gaze softening into grudging attention as the morning's revelations began to unfold. The assembled company reflected the village's hidden tensions made manifest. Elena and Dr. Pemberton occupied the velvet settee with forced composure, their carefully maintained facades showing dangerous cracks under sustained observation. Lionel Fawcett hovered near the doorway with theatrical nonchalance that fooled no one, while Miss Fairfax trembled visibly as she clutched a library book that provided insufficient cover for her obvious distress. The psychological pressure Miss Marple had been carefully building over the past days was approaching its inevitable climax. Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through the charged atmosphere with deceptive casualness as she turned the pages of Mrs. Hartwell's meticulous documentation. "These photographic records are quite extraordinary in their thoroughness," she observed, her finger tracing a particularly detailed image of pristine white lilies. Mrs. Hartwell noted everything about her specimens, including their peculiar sensitivity to handling. This Lilium candidum, for instance, was notorious for shedding golden pollen at the slightest touch, making it nearly impossible to handle without leaving unmistakable traces on skin and clothing. The seemingly innocent observation created immediate tension as she continued with deliberate precision. How curious, then, that the lily found in Mrs. Hartwell's hand bore not a single grain of pollen, despite appearing freshly picked. One might almost conclude that its anthers had been surgically removed with the kind of precision that requires both specialized knowledge and remarkably steady hands, perhaps even medical training. Dr. Pemberton's jaw tightened perceptibly, while Eleanor's hand flew instinctively to her throat, their synchronized reactions revealing the deep connection between their professional skills and the crime's execution. Miss Marple's keen observation of these subtle responses confirmed her suspicions about the systematic nature of the botanical theft operation that had preceded Mrs. Hartwell's murder. The psychological trap reached its crucial phase when Miss Marple produced a selection of fresh lily stems from the manor's surviving beds, arranging them on the morning room table alongside a pristine white cloth. "Perhaps we might create a memorial arrangement," she suggested with innocent enthusiasm, "though we must be careful with the pollen, as it stains so terribly, and these old linens are quite irreplaceable." The responses to this seemingly benevolent exercise proved devastatingly revealing. Elena moved with unconscious expertise, her practiced fingers automatically pinching away anthers with the economical precision of someone thoroughly familiar with botanical preservation techniques. Dr. Pemberton reached instinctively for his medical case, producing surgical forceps with the automatic efficiency of professional habit, his movements betraying knowledge that extended far beyond casual gardening interest. Most damaging of all was Fawcett's casual mention of camphor paper as superior preservation material, revealing specialized knowledge of international plant shipping methods that no legitimate antique dealer would possess. The lingering scent of camphor that Miss Marple had detected at his shop now took on sinister significance as evidence of systematic botanical smuggling operations. The documentary evidence provided the final pieces of an increasingly undeniable puzzle. Mrs. Hartwell's photographs revealed systematic depletion of rare varieties over several months, with valuable specimens disappearing in patterns that suggested careful selection rather than natural mortality. The timing of these disappearances corresponded precisely with Elena's family financial crisis and Dr. Pemberton's increasing knowledge of preservation techniques that would maintain specimen value during international transport. The breakthrough moment arrived when Miss Marple questioned the surgical precision evident in the crime scene staging. If one were to remove lily anthers for preservation purposes, she mused with characteristic gentleness, what instrument would achieve such clean, precise cuts without damaging the delicate petals? Elena's protective instincts finally overwhelmed her caution as she blurted out, "Surgical scissors, naturally. Jeffrey has several sets in his medical kit. He always uses them for the most delicate work." The words hung in the morning air like an indictment, her desperate attempt to defend her husband's professional competence instead revealing the specialized tools that had enabled their crimes. The confession that followed came in fragments as their carefully constructed deception collapsed under accumulated evidence and psychological pressure. Elena's family debts to dangerous creditors had made the lily theft operation seem like salvation rather than crime, while Dr. Pemberton's medical expertise had enabled the precise timing and execution necessary when Mrs. Hartwell's investigation threatened to expose their elaborate network. Fawcett's antique business had provided perfect cover for international shipping arrangements that transformed stolen specimens into untraceable profits. The murder itself had been committed when Mrs. Hartwell confronted Elena about her suspicions, threatening to involve authorities and destroy the financial lifeline that represented their only escape from crushing debt and criminal retribution. The systematic theft had been ongoing for months, with the locked gate providing security that the conspirators had circumvented through their duplicate key and intimate knowledge of the garden's layout. The pristine lily placed in Mrs. Hartwell's hand had been Elena's twisted tribute to the woman whose trust they had systematically violated, a symbol of botanical perfection that mocked the violence necessary to complete their criminal enterprise. The careful staging of the crime scene, including the theatrical lock damage and scattered flowers, had been designed to suggest external intrusion while concealing the internal betrayal that had actually occurred. As Inspector Morrison stepped forward to make the arrests that would finally bring justice for Mrs. Hartwell's murder, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic transformations of desperate people into predators, their specialized knowledge and professional skills perverted into instruments of theft and violence. The lily garden would eventually bloom again, though the innocence that had once made Little Wickham seem like paradise had been lost forever among the scattered petals of that terrible afternoon. The morning room fell silent, except for the distant sound of bees continuing their ancient work among flowers that would outlive the human dramas played out in their shadow. A reminder that some forms of beauty endure even when human nature reveals its darkest capabilities. The arrests of Dr. Geoffrey Pemberton, Elena, and Lionel Fawcett sent shockwaves through Little Wickham that would reverberate for months to come. Inspector Morrison's professional efficiency could not soften the brutal reality that 3 respected community members had systematically betrayed the trust placed in them. Elena's desperate sob as the handcuffs clicked into place, Dr. Pemberton's cold resignation, and Fawcett's theatrical protests of innocence created a scene that would be replayed in village memory long after the police vehicles had disappeared down the lane. The community's initial response reflected the particular devastation that comes when familiar faces are revealed as masks concealing calculated evil. Mrs. Bantry was heard to remark that she would never again feel confident in her judgment of character, while the postmaster confessed to his wife that he had always sensed something unsettling about Fawcett's too-perfect knowledge of everyone's business. The very foundations of village trust, built over generations of shared experiences and mutual dependence, seemed to shift beneath their feet like unstable ground. Sebastian Blackwood's release brought profound relief, tempered by the sobering knowledge of how close he had come to conviction for crimes he had never contemplated. His gratitude toward Miss Marple was expressed with characteristic restraint, though his handshake lingered with the weight of a man who understood that his life had been saved by her quiet persistence in pursuing truth over convenience. The financial arrangements his aunt had made would now proceed as planned, though the inheritance carried bitter knowledge of the price paid for its preservation. Inspector Morrison surprised everyone by visiting Miss Marple the following afternoon to offer an apology that was more valuable for its rarity than its eloquence. He admitted that her memorial garden proposal had been quite the net for catching our criminals, and that botanical evidence had accomplished what traditional police work had failed to achieve. He left with a slice of seed cake and a respect that transformed his entire approach to seemingly impossible cases. Miss Dorothy Fairfax's situation required delicate handling, her forged postal receipt having been motivated by misguided loyalty rather than criminal intent. The authorities, influenced by Miss Marple's gentle advocacy, resolved the matter through community service rather than prosecution, though Dorothy's position as village librarian would never quite recover its former unquestioned respectability. The Reverend Timothy Ashford's pastoral support during this difficult period revealed depths of compassion that helped heal some of the community's wounded trust in human goodness. Tom Weaver found himself elevated to head gardener with Sebastian's enthusiastic endorsement, his previously dour demeanor brightening like a greenhouse in spring as he spoke of soil amendments and the patient work of coaxing rare varieties back from surviving bulbs. The practical nature of this appointment pleased the village more than any dramatic gesture could have done, representing continuity and hope for the future of Mrs. Hartwell's beloved garden. The locked gate itself underwent symbolic transformation, its ornate Victorian ironwork no longer bearing the burden of protecting secrets, but standing open as a testament to transparency and trust restored. Sebastian's decision to establish the garden as a memorial collection, managed by the Royal Horticultural Society in partnership with Tom's expertise, ensured that Mrs. Hartwell's botanical legacy would flourish while removing the painful associations from daily village life. The physical evidence of the conspiracy, methodically catalogued by Morrison's team, revealed the sophisticated nature of the international smuggling operation that had used Little Wickham's peaceful facade as cover for systematic theft. The preserved lily specimens, shipping documentation, and correspondence with overseas contacts painted a comprehensive picture of greed and expertise perverted down into instruments of betrayal and violence. As autumn approached and the immediate shock began to settle into acceptance, Miss Marple reflected on the enduring complexities of human nature that had once again revealed themselves through seemingly impossible circumstances. The pristine lily found in Mrs. Hartwell's hand had indeed been placed there after death, a twisted signature from criminals who understood botanical symbolism well enough to mock it through violence. The community's healing process would be neither quick nor complete, but the essential rhythms of village life gradually reasserted themselves with the resilience that characterizes places where people must continue living together despite having witnessed the worst of human capability. Children returned to playing in the manor grounds, though with a new understanding that beauty and danger could coexist in the same carefully tended spaces. Miss Marple's role in exposing the conspiracy earned her quiet recognition that she neither sought nor particularly valued, her satisfaction coming instead from the knowledge that truth had prevailed over elaborate deception. Her methodical attention to details that others had overlooked, the absent pollen, the theatrical lock damage, the strategic positioning of evidence, had once again demonstrated that the most sophisticated crimes often contained the seeds of their own exposure. When the first spring bulbs began emerging the following season, Miss Marple visited the restored garden to find new growth pushing through soil that had witnessed both beauty and betrayal. The locked gate stood permanently open now, its protective function transformed into an invitation for those who approached with genuine appreciation rather than calculating greed. She placed a small bouquet from her own border where Mrs. Hartwell had fallen, not as ceremony but as courtesy between gardeners who understood that some forms of beauty endure even when human nature reveals its darkest capabilities. Walking home through hedgerows where gossip and honeysuckle grew with equal persistence, Miss Marple smiled to hear someone remark that it was she who had seen what others missed, though you would think she noticed nothing but her knitting. She saw rather more than that, of course, but there was no need to say so. Mysteries, like gardens, flourished best with a little quiet tending and the patient understanding that truth, however carefully buried, would eventually find its way to the light.